Well, we started last week kind of a new series that is about the church. It's maybe a little different than what you would expect. We're kind of starting with the realization that the church is not the building, and that's not a new thought, but we're seeing it certainly in a new context. The church is not the building. In fact, there's another thing that I've heard during this time, not just that it's never been about the building, but I've seen memes or pictures about the church has left the building. And so certainly middle of March, we might say that the church left the building. I hope that that happened long before that, because it's never been about the building. The church is not the building. As we talked last week, the church is the people. It's a people gathered and following Christ. It's the gathered ones, the called out ones. And that can happen without buildings, and in many countries it does. And for the last 2 months, it's been happening. For the last 2 months, the church has been gathering on the internet, has been gathering over the telephone, has been gathering so many different ways as we continue to seek to follow Christ and being connected with each other and caring for each other and caring for the world around us, the people around us, and seeking to be channels of God's love and God's light wherever we are. So last week we started this. The kind of the title, if you will, if the church is not the building, then what is it? And last week we looked at the idea of promise, because it's interesting. Even though the church is not the building, in the scriptures we find a lot of language of building to describe the church. In fact, the reason we started with promise is that when you're building a building, you don't start with the foundation. You have to start with the idea. You have to start with the intention. And with the church, it was more than just intention, it was promise. And so we look, really two promises in Matthew 16, verse 18, where Jesus said, first of all, I will build my church. That's a promise. That's a statement of something he would do. And the second half of that was, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. Two promises. That's the foundation. That's where the church began, was in the intention of God. In the promise of Jesus Christ, I will build my church, he said, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. Now that's from Matthew 16, verse 18. Now there's a larger context to this, and today we're going to move from promise into foundation, because if we just spread that verse out a little bit more, there's some things that came before it. And so the first thing that came before, I will build this church, or I will build my church, was the statement of the foundation, where Jesus said, upon this rock, I will build my church. Now there's more context than that, and we heard Chuck read that earlier. But upon this rock, I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. And so that's talking about foundations. Jesus said, upon this rock, I will build my church. And that raises the question, what rock? All right, so we're going to park on this question for a little bit, and I wasn't able to pull some slides together for this next part, so don't pay attention to what's over my head, except that's the question we're talking about. And you need to listen. Focus in on this. The passage began, as Chuck read, Jesus had a question for his disciples, and his question was simply this: who do people say that the Son of Man is? That was a way that Jesus referred to himself frequently. What's the scuttlebutt out there? Who do people say that I am? The disciples said, oh, some say you're John the Baptist. And another disciple said, oh, and some say you're Elijah. Someone else said, oh, some say you're Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. And I can imagine Jesus kind of nodding, maybe smiling a little bit, I don't know. But then he looks at them right in the eyes and he says, "But who do you say that I am?" And it was Peter. It was Peter who spoke up and said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." That word Messiah is the same word we get Christ from. You are the anointed one. You are the Messiah. You are the one God promised from centuries ago, promised through the prophets. You are God's chosen one, God's anointed one. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus said, bless you, Simon. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. You didn't come up with that all by yourself, but the Father, my Father, your Father, has revealed that to you. I mean, just imagine the feeling, the emotion, the joy in Jesus' heart in affirming Peter in that moment. He didn't always have the opportunity to affirm Peter. Sometimes Peter needed a rebuke like all of us. But in this moment, you just sense this delight. I'm just so happy, Peter, that you come to that realization, and that's something that you couldn't just figure out yourself. You've been listening to God, and God has revealed that to you. And then he makes this remarkable statement. He says, "You're Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Say, okay, that still doesn't tell us what the rock is. What is that? What does that refer to? Well, I'm going to tell you what I believe it doesn't refer to, but there's a play on words going here. The Greek word for Peter this is going to be a big surprise. You'd never have guessed it in a million years. The Greek for Peter is Petros. Well, you might never have guessed it, but it sounds pretty close. Petros was the name for Peter. That's Greek for Peter. So he says, "You are Petros. And on this rock," you know what the word for rock was in this case, in this particular grammatical formation? "You are Petros, and on this Petra, I will build my church." You are Petros, and on this Petra, I will build my church. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what Jesus was doing here. It was an obvious play on words. And some would say, well, Peter, really that form of the word for rock, that Peter's name means like a little stone, and this is a big rock, and maybe you can get that, but others will say, well, he was going to build a church on the foundation of Peter. I don't think that works, and I'm going to explain why. Because I think this is way, way bigger than Peter. Peter was a part of it. As we're going to see, Peter was an important part, but Peter was not the foundation of the church. Perhaps Jesus was saying, on this rock, you're a rock, Peter, but on this rock, pointing to himself. Perhaps. I think maybe it's more likely that he's talking about the rock, the foundation of Peter's profession, that you are the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But it's even bigger than that. So we're going to go back, and then we're going to go forward. Or from your perspective, we're going to go back in history, and then we're going to go forward even after the time of Christ, and we're going to just put this together real briefly this morning. So when I say back in history, we're going to start with Matthew 7. And Matthew 7 is not that far back, maybe a year or two before this. Matthew 7 is the last part of the Sermon on the Mount. So in Matthew 7, chapter 7, verses 24-27, Jesus is wrapping up the Sermon on the Mount, and he makes this statement. He says, "Anyone who listens to my teachings and follows it is wise." And then he goes on to say, not only they're wise, but they're wise just like, and he makes this analogy, this comparison. He says, anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise, like a person who builds a house on solid rock. Petron, depends on the part of speech, whether it has this ending or that ending, but it's the same word here. It's the same word Jesus uses where he says, on this rock. This was a concept that was not brand new. The idea of using the image of rock as a solid foundation to be metaphorical for how we build our lives, for the truths on which we build our lives. See, in that passage in Matthew 7, Jesus was saying, a wise person is going to listen to my words, is going to live them out, incorporate them in his or her life. And that person who does that is like a builder who builds his house on a rock, a solid foundation. When the storms come, and they will, when the winds beat against the house, and they will, it will stand because of its foundation. And he wasn't finished with his parable, if you will, with his metaphor. He says, but the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice, does not build his life upon them, is like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. Not a real good foundation. And when the storms come, and they will, and when the rains beat against the house, and they will, the house collapses. The disciples had heard that. They knew that idea of using this building analogy and this foundation analogy. They knew that. And so when Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church, I don't think they're thinking, oh, is he talking about Peter? I think Jesus was playing a little bit and said, hey, Peter, you've just identified who I am. You've just told me I'm the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Well, you're Peter. Let me tell you something about rocks, about foundations for living. What you just said, who I am, what I came to teach, what I came to do, that's going to be this rock that I'm going to build my church on. And the gates of hell, all the powers of hell, will not overcome it, will not destroy it, will not conquer it. But there's more to it than that. We go back even further to the Old Testament prophets. Isaiah, in Isaiah 28, verse 16. Listen to this passage. The prophet Isaiah says, therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am placing a foundation stone in Jerusalem. This is God promising hundreds of years earlier. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to place a foundation stone, a rock in Jerusalem, a firm and tested stone. It is a precious cornerstone that is safe to build on. Whoever believes need never be shaken. Well, that's kind of powerful. God says, I'm gonna bring this rock, this tested and tried rock, this reliable rock, and I'm gonna place it in Jerusalem, in Zion. And it's gonna be a cornerstone, it's gonna be a foundation stone for something brand new. And whoever believes in what that stone represents, whoever believes in that stone, is never going to be disappointed, never going to be shaken, is never going to have the storms of life destroy it. They're going to stand. It's going to be a solid foundation, he says. You say, well, that's interesting. How do we know these two are connected? Well, we have some other people who think they're connected. Fast forward now. I told you we're going to go back and then forward further. Fast forward to Ephesians chapter 2, and this is the Apostle Paul now, several years later. Christ at this time has already died, resurrected, returned to heaven. The church has already been born and persecuted and growing, and here's the Apostle Paul, years later, writing to a church in Ephesus. A gathering, not a building. People in Ephesus. who are united in following Christ, in building their lives on the foundation of who he is and what he did and what he said. Paul wrote it this way in Ephesians 2:20. Together, we are his house. I love those words. No, it's not a building. Together, you and I, we are his house, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. Say, wait a minute. I thought you said it wasn't Peter. I thought you said it was Jesus. Well, we're not done yet. The very next phrase, and the cornerstone, there's that word echoing back to Isaiah's prophecy. The cornerstone is Christ himself. Say, okay, yeah, that makes some sense. But I'm still not sure. You know, that Peter thing, that was just too much of a play. It just sounded a lot like he's saying, Peter, I'm going to build my church on you. But how about if we ask Peter what he thought, what he understood? Would that settle it for us? 1 Peter chapter 2, a letter Peter wrote to all the believers throughout the region. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 to 6. Peter's talking to those who are turning to Christ, and he says to them and to us, you are coming to Christ. You've heard about him. You've said yes to following him. You're building your life on his foundation. You are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone. What a great word to put together this analogy, this metaphor of this physical stone. It's a foundation of a literal building, and say, no, Jesus is that, but he's so much more. He is a living stone. He's a living rock. He's this living foundation. He says, you've heard about Christ and you're turning to him in faith. Well, you're coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone. Unless there be any question about Peter understanding this, he says next, as the scriptures say, and now guess who he quotes? He quotes Isaiah, where God said, I am placing a cornerstone in Jerusalem, and anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. I want to encourage you this morning. We're going to stop right there. There's a whole lot more to do to talk about the church. And next Sunday, we're going to celebrate because it's Pentecost Sunday, and that's the birthday of the church. And we're going to talk about, in history, Jesus has made these promises. He's declared the foundation of the church being himself. And then next Sunday, we're going to talk about how that began to happen in the book of Acts, how that began to happen on the day that we identify, that we know as Pentecost Sunday. It was Pentecost in the Jewish calendar long before these events happened, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're going to talk about that next week, and we're looking for some creative ways to try to add to that celebration and acknowledge some of the breadth of our congregation, and even beyond our congregation, and get even some more people involved, maybe not here in this space, but so you pray for us as we work on that, and we invite you to come back next week as we continue to look at, if the church is not a building, then what is it? And we've laid a great foundation for this series now, but we've got a lot more we can talk about, because God's plan for the church is just a wonderful plan. And the church as God intended is not always the church as we see it. Same thing here. The church as God intended. We fail and we fall in trying to live out God's calling. But we want to remind ourselves of what that calling is, of who we are as his church. It's not about us, it's about him. It's about the foundation. And it's about ordering our lives according to that cornerstone, taking our shape and our structure from him. And so again, I hope you'll join us in the coming weeks as we continue together, as we continue to try to work at the technology end of things, and as we seek to try to be the church that God calls us to be.